Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jakub Janda, and I represent the European Values think tank over here, and I will be moderating this public debate. So this public debate will be all only in English without any interpretation, so I hope that you all will enjoy that. And at first, let me say a few words about this project which we are presenting here today, and also this event or public discussion which is currently being in process. So at first, let me say something about the project which we have organized as European Values think tank with cooperation with League of Human Rights based in Brno, Czech Republic, and the Center for European Policy Studies based in Brussels. This project, called Defining Responses to Rise of Extremism in Europe, was supported by a think tank fund of Europe Open Society Institute based in Budapest, which we gratefully thank for their support. So today's event, called Integration of Immigrants, a Key Political Challenge, is also supported by think tank fund of Open Society Foundation and organized with cooperation of Embassy of Netherlands to the Czech Republic, League of Human Rights Brno, and representation of the European Commission to Prague. So we would like again thank all the partners and co-organizers of this public debate. And then let me invite today's speakers to the floor, and I will start one by one. So every speaker will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and at the end we will have time for discussion. This public debate should end at 17:30, and then we would like to invite you for a small reception at the premises of the European House. So the first speaker will be Radko Hokovský, sitting on my left. He will have a presentation over here. And Radko Hokovský is a university lecturer and executive director and chairman of the European Values think tank. Between 2007 and 2010, he was the president of an international research project called European Values Network. In the past, he has also worked as an assistant to the member of European Parliament, and he has also worked at the Association for International Affairs in Prague and Youth European Parliament in the Czech Republic. His interests are internal security of the European Union and institutional affairs of the European Union. He lectures at the Institute of Political Sciences of Faculty of Social Sciences of Charles University in Prague and Metropolitan University in Prague. So Radko, floor is yours, and you have 15 to 20 minutes. Depends how fast you speak.
All right, thank you very much. The reason why I'm speaking first, maybe, do we have this little mic which I can keep in my hand? Maybe it's more practical. So the reason why I'm speaking first is not that it would be the most important presentation, more insightful, because my colleagues, distinguished professors and experts in the field will give much more insight, but I have actually an international comparison. So that's the reason why I'm speaking the first, and this is actually the first opportunity to present some of the first outcomes from the project which was funded by think tank fund of the Open Society Foundations. And I will especially focus on the programs of political parties in 4 countries. And this is the first part of a publication which will be published by the end of this month. The title is Politics and Policies of Integration in Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Denmark, and at the EU level. So let me define the research question and the context actually. So if we have a look on European countries today, we can see that there is rise of popularity of extremist solution across Europe in basically all the countries. And we can see that the main rhetoric target of these extremist far-right or at least populist parties or movements is targeted primarily on minorities or immigrants. or currently also in the context of the economic crisis and maybe institutional problems of the European Union, we can see that the target of populist and extremist parties is also the EU, but this is not the subject for my talk. Secondly, the mainstream parties actually lose voters to the extremists, especially, but not only the center-right political parties. Are losing voters, and they are aware of that, and they are looking for solutions how to gain the voters back. And actually this was the main motivation behind our research project, and our question is basically why the extremist political parties dominate the political discourse on immigrants and minorities, and what the mainstream political parties can do about it. So as I said, we have looked on 4 countries, 2 in the post-communist Central Europe, meaning Czech Republic and Hungary, and we have chosen 2 rather small or middle-sized countries in the, let's say, Western Europe, namely Austria and Denmark. And also we have looked on the European level, mainly the European Parliament and the political groups in the European Parliaments and the so-called Euro parties. What was our methodology? Well, basically we have focused on the latest political cycle since the last national elections. So our studies of the political parties have basically covered last 2, 3 or 4 years. But taking into account the context of the previous 20 years of development. We have focused on 2 major mainstream political parties, meaning the mainstream center-right and center-left party, and also the major extremist, or if you will, far-right or populist parties. And we have analyzed the programs of these parties, election manifestos of these parties, and also public statements as they appear in the national media. For each country we have identified 1 major national printed newspaper, and we have analyzed in this period of about 3 years in each country what these parties or their leadership said about immigration policy, integration of immigrants and minorities. And basically we have looked on statements related to citizenship, integration, immigration, discrimination, and finally on these specific minorities or groups of immigrants which are relevant for the public discourse in these countries, meaning Muslim or Islam in case of Austria and Denmark, and especially on the Roma community in the Central European countries. And not only that, we have analyzed how these parties actually justified their statements, how they explained their proposals, how the mainstream as well as the extremist parties actually explained to the voters why they are for restrictive or liberal immigration policy and integration measures. And we have basically distinguished between a pragmatic approach, which would give some arguments concerning money, spending, how it is expensive to integrate minorities, or what are the costs for the society if they are not integrated. We have distinguished identity-based arguments, which would be concerning nationality, nationalism, sovereignty, distinction between value systems, and so on. And finally, also moral universal arguments or justifications, which would be, for example, justice or equality. So let's have a look on our main findings. So these 4 countries are very different in many ways. In terms of the variable political context in the past 20 years, in case of what are actually these parties in the mainstream and on the extreme right, and they are also different in their demographic structure. meaning that these minorities, which are the main point of political discussion in the Central European countries, are of course Roma, and in these two Western European countries are rather Muslims. However, what is actually striking is the similarity in the percentage of justification. And what this table shows is actually that if we have a look on Austria, for example, where the difference is most striking or most visible, is that in case of 75% of all statements of far-right parties, basically this one Freedom Party of Austria, have justification. So the party is explaining why they are for restrictive immigration policy, or why they are for tougher rules on integration of the immigrants. And on the other side, we can see that the mainstream parties are much less willing to actually explain why they are for example, liberal immigration policy in case of the center left, why they are actually for not restrictive, why they are for equality, why they are putting forward the value of justice, and so on. And we can see that this is actually the case for all the countries we have analyzed. In simple words, the far right, the extremist parties, are simply more precise in explanation and justification of their positions, and the mainstream parties are much less willing or able to explain why they are actually for liberal, restrictive policies which they are proposing or putting forward. We don't have precise figures for Hungary, but the result is the same. Interesting case is the Czech Republic. It's actually in this context quite different, because the Czech Republic is the only country where far-right party is not in the parliament, in the national parliament. And we can see that actually the center-left is most let's say, active in explaining why they are in favor of more liberal immigration policy. However, in case of the Czech Republic, we have also seen or found that the number of statements concerning immigration and integration of immigrants and minorities is actually the lowest. I mean, it's the least in the context of these countries, or in comparison to other countries. We can see that in the Czech Republic, this issue is simply the weakest in comparison to the others. It's simply not that high on the agenda as in the other countries. And what would be our recommendations for the mainstream parties? Well, in order to actually dominate the political discourse, in order to dominate the agenda, we would propose to the mainstream parties that they should actually politicize the issue of integration of minorities and immigrants. They should not leave it as a technical issue, because if they don't speak about it, if they don't explain what is their position and why is that, then the extremists will simply keep that issue and will be gaining votes. Secondly, we would propose to the mainstream political parties that they should actually put this issue higher on the agenda. This goes in line with the first recommendation. We believe that the mainstream parties should speak more about this. They should speak more about integration of immigrants and minorities. And they should compete between each other on this issue, develop better policies, and compete between center-left and center-right, in order to avoid the situation which is not right now, that the mainstream is actually fighting with the extreme. which leads to more bigger radicalization of the whole discourse. And finally, we would, in practical terms, we would advise the mainstream political parties that they should actually appoint political speakers for this issue, and they should also choose experts with whom to develop coherent policy, coherent proposals with clear justification, which would be understandable to the voters, and thus prevent the rise of extremists. That would be all. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Radko. So Radko took it for 12 minutes, a record time so far. And the second speaker, as this panel negotiated, would be Mrs. Lange. She is here at the invitation of the Dutch Embassy to Prague, which we are grateful once again. So Mrs. Lange is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam, and she is also a visiting scholar at the Goethe University, where she is currently working at 2 large-scale research projects. The first one is called Political Conflict in 5 European Systems, the role of citizens, the media, the parties, in politicalization of immigration and European integration. So this is the first project she's working on. And the second one is called Newly Governing Parties, Success or Failure. So Sarah would be speaking right here as well, and she does have her presentation. So Radko started with 12 minutes, so...
I'll see if I can top that.
So we'll see that.
First of all, I would very much like to thank the European Values think tank for having me here, and of course also the Dutch Embassy. As you've gathered from Radko's presentation, the Netherlands was not part of the project, so I think I'm bringing hopefully some new information to the table here. Thank you. I'm a political scientist by training, so I primarily look at political parties, and I've studied populism in the Netherlands, but also in other Western European and Eastern European countries for 11 years now. And when you think about the Netherlands these days, one of the first things that comes to mind is this figure. He's probably one of the most well-known populist radical right-wing politicians in Western Europe. Geert Wilders, with a very distinct look, very well known for his movie Května, which created a lot of national and international controversy. But in fact, the Netherlands, I think I'm fine, right, without the mic, yeah. In fact, the Netherlands for centuries was known for tolerance and for accepting minorities into the Netherlands and having them live in the Netherlands with guarding their own culture to a large extent. And it's only very recently that has changed. In the 1990s, when a lot of the European countries were talking about, including Austria and also to some extent Denmark, already had some form of anti-immigrant party, the SPA in Austria, to some extent also the Progress Party in Denmark, which was taking up these issues. No such party existed in the Netherlands. There was the Centre Democrats, but as you can see, that party never gained more than 3% of the votes, which even in the proportional Dutch system is hardly anything. In 2002, the situation changed dramatically. Pim Fortuyn, who you might also remember as a very flamboyant politician, entered the Dutch political scene and immediately captured 17% of the votes and became the second largest party in the Netherlands. And his emergence and his success has really altered the political agenda in the Netherlands and has had a huge impact on policy making. His party was very short-lived. Already in 2003 there were new elections because the party collapsed and the success disappeared. But he was quickly replaced by Geert Wilders, who managed to tap into the same kind of reservoir of discontent with immigration policies. And as you can see, he's been doing quite well in the recent elections in 2006, 2010 and 2012. Now, what has the impact of these two parties been in the Netherlands, especially when we look at immigration and integration policies? Well, the direct impact has actually been very small. The LPF is in government for 3 months in 2002, which was a far too short period to change any policies. And even Geert Wilders, who supported a minority government from 2010 to 2012, didn't have a lot of impact because it simply takes a lot longer for governments to present policy proposals. Even when these parties have been in opposition, their direct influence, for example, by proposing amendments in Parliament, by asking questions, has been relatively contained. However, their indirect influence through mainstream parties has been substantial. And even though the study was not done in the Netherlands, I think I have some data which are quite similar to yours and which will show what happened in the Netherlands and how this process has gone about. I think that the influence of these populist radical right parties on the immigration and integration agenda takes 3 forms. First of all, that of agenda setting. The fact that immigration issues have become more prominent in both the Dutch political and the public debate is largely attributable to these parties simply by the fact that mainstream parties have adopted the same issues as they have. Of course, this has 2 elements. First of all, the mainstream parties, and this is sort of a normative concern, have realized that because of the emergence of these parties, that has been an indication that they have not fulfilled their representative duties. They've insufficiently listened to the public and they weren't in touch with certain segments of the electorate, most notably lower educated voters, who were already in the 1990s expressing preferences for more restrictive immigration policies. The second is, of course, more strategic. A lot of the mainstream parties in the Netherlands, and this goes for both the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and to a lesser extent the Liberals, have lost voters to these populist radical right parties, and they would very much like them back. So this is a very pragmatic reason why they've adopted these issues. The second thing that they have done is that they've adopted the framing of immigration and integration issues. So you can discuss these issues in very different ways and emphasize different aspects of the problem. And I'll show you that they've adopted the same kind of frames that the populist radical right parties use as well. And the third is that they've moved towards more restrictive immigration policies in terms of substance, of concrete policy proposals. Now, to look at the first issue, this is the attention that the Dutch parties have devoted to immigration issues from 1994 to 2010. You see that the attention was very low in the 1990s. It was less than 2% in 1994, for example. It was still not very high in 2002 when Lijst Pim Fortuyn emerged, because of course it takes some time for parties to properly respond. But the elections after that, the attention for immigration issues increased dramatically in the programs of mainstream parties. And it's only been with the emergence of the economic crisis that it has declined a little bit again because other issues needed some attention as well. The second aspect is that of framing. Now, if we look at immigration and integration issues, there's actually not a lot of debate about the framing of immigration issues. It's simply who is allowed into the country and under what conditions. So it's about asylum seekers, for example. It's about the speed of the acceptance process of applications, etc. That is the top line. And as you can see, there's been a little bit more attention for immigration, but overall that is quite stable across time. More interesting are these 2 lines, which are both about the integration of immigrants. Now, the one that goes up is anything related to the cultural integration of immigrants. So about Islam, for example, about whether migrants are allowed to wear headscarves in public, whether mosques can have minarets, whether there should be any measures against forced marriage, everything related to culture. That has gone up dramatically. Whereas attention for the socio-economic integration of migrants, things related to the labor markets, to housing, to education, for example, issues of black and white schools, segregation in neighborhoods, that has gone down dramatically. So you see a complete refocus in the integration debate as to how the problem is defined and, of course, consequentially, what kind of solutions are proposed by the parties. That is also reflected in the positions of parties, regardless of the kind of issues we look at and regardless of the framing adopted. The proposed measures have become more restrictive across the political spectrum. So even the Green Party in the Netherlands, which is one of the most left-wing libertarian parties, proposes stricter measures now than it did 10 years ago, and the same goes for the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the Liberals. Across the political spectrum, there has been a move towards sort of more authoritarian stances. This has not been without cost, especially in the left-wing parties. It has created a lot of inter-party conflicts. The Labour Party has had some very serious debates and falling out about integration issues and whether any kind of assimilation program is compatible with social democracy. The same goes for the Christian Democratic Party, where a substantial number of members have actually left the party once it decided to govern with PVV in 2010. So it can also be a very divisive thing. Now, the LPF and the PVV have had relatively little impact on government policy, but it doesn't mean that government policy hasn't changed. The LPF was in government in 2002, and its government participation was very short-lived. But the two cabinets that succeeded that cabinet, namely Balkenende 2 and 3, actually proposed an entirely new integration program, which is known as the Inburgeringswet. And it contains basically two major reforms. The first is that anyone who wants to come to the Netherlands has to take a sort of educational program on Dutch values within the country of origin and then take a test at the embassy to see whether you're admissible to the Netherlands. So this goes for anyone who wants to do family reunification or anyone who wants to immigrate, for example, to the Netherlands for economic reasons. The second is that it's been made much more difficult to get a residence permit once you're here. And to obtain that, you have to go through an integration program which is focused on adopting Dutch norms and values. So it contains questions about gay rights, for example, and other things that we think of as typically Dutch. And it also contains a language test, because it is now considered that language is probably the primary agent for integration. So this was directly after the LPF. Now, currently, which we already saw with the one cabinet, but we also see with the current government that just assumed office this fall, we see sort of new trajectories developing, which have not been put into practice yet. They are proposals that are in the coalition agreement, but that also clearly bear the signature of populist radical right parties. And they're actually, in many respects, sort of copies of what has already been proposed in Denmark over the past years. And you see a very clear match between what the Danish People's Party has proposed in the past and what is currently being discussed in the Netherlands. So the three axes that are discernible in the coalition agreement are one, breaking open any agreements made with the EU regarding immigration issues. Denmark has an opt-out, so it has much more leeway to change immigration and integration policies. We cannot do that in the Netherlands. But the current government, like the last government, would like to discuss whether it's possible to have a bit more space there. For example, to make it possible to raise the age for family reunification to 24 years, to make a higher threshold in terms of income for family reunification. So that's a system that looks very much like Denmark, I think. The second thing that we clearly see is the securitization of immigration and integration issues. So a strong emphasis on the relationship between crime, security, and immigration. And one of the major proposals being discussed right now in that light is to make illegality a crime, so that you can actually be put in jail for being illegal in the country. Another thing that is being discussed in that light is to expel immigrants that have committed crimes regardless of their status in the Netherlands. And the third axis that we clearly see, and this is also very similar to Denmark, I think, is the emergence of welfare chauvinism, of proposals that suggest that immigrants have fewer access or less access to the welfare state than Dutch natives. So, for example, lower or later security benefits. So all in all, you can say that even though the direct influence of populist radical parties is not as strong, the impact on the actual policies is very clearly there. And it's partly because mainstream parties have politicized immigration and integration issues. So in that respect, I'm not sure whether the Dutch case supports your recommendation in that light. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah. So you didn't manage it, it was 14 minutes, but still we'll have more time for discussion. So thanks to Sarah, and the next speaker would be speaking from my right, or he would move to the microphone, it depends how good singer he is. But Mr. Bernhard Perchining is a senior research officer at the International Center for Migration Policy Development, and he will represent the situation in Austria. He also teaches at the Danube University of Krems and at the Salzburg University. So Mr. Perchining, it's yours.
Thank you very much. I moved here because I need my presentation, and I will now try to give you a short overview on some structural, demographic, and political developments in Austria. So I will give you a first overview on demographics, then the second on the main policy developments, which I will explain to you, and then we will discuss maybe some differences and similarities to Denmark. I don't think that I need that. I start with demography because it's interesting to see that integration discussion in Austria doesn't have a lot to do with actual immigration. It has a lot to do with immigration which took part 15 years ago. So if you look here at the foreign-born population in Austria, you see that we have a kind of two-third, one-third situation. About one-third is originating from the European Union, old member, new member states, and Switzerland. One-third about from the former Yugoslavia, about 13% from Turkey, and the rest is all over the world. So we have quite a clear picture with, this is the traditional guest-work recruitment immigration. And actually, if you're looking at the discussion on immigration, you're discussing about this group, about the Turkish group. So we're not discussing about immigration and integration, we're not discussing about very specific. To show you what has happened, this is also interesting to see. Austria underwent a complete change in immigration patterns in the last 12 years. In 2002, and it was even more than in 2000, two-thirds to three-quarters of all immigrants who entered annually net, this is the net immigration, originated from so-called third countries, non-European Union member countries, and about 10% each of the old and the new European Union countries. This changed dramatically. Now, about one-third is originating from third countries, and the vast majority of immigrants is coming from European Union countries. Which also means that regarding state policies on immigration, state policies on immigration don't regulate immigration, they regulate only a very small portion of immigration anymore, because only with regard to third countries, the state can impose regulations, and even within this group, there is about one-third which has the right to immigrate because of European Union legislation. So the current immigration is quite different than the immigration was 10-15 years ago, and actually there's very little discussion about this immigration groups from the new and the old Europe as it's termed in Austria. This is how the discussion usually is figured out. Social situation, you see Austrians, this is the standard of living analysis from 2007, picturing quite clearly that you have a big difference between Austrian citizens and Union citizens, which are about the same, and other foreign citizens, third countries, that if it would take Turkish immigrants, it would be even less. So this is the debate as it usually is framed. We are discussing about principles with regard to discussion. Also, you see it in the pictures. This is a publication from the Ministry of the Interior, and you also see it here that the frame is how do people develop with regard to schooling. There's very little differentiation, showing there has been improvement, but still there's a huge social division. So this is one of the frames of the discussions. What happened now? Sorry. And another thing which is maybe interesting for you to note, that naturalizations in Austria, despite the fact that they have declined significantly, aren't discussed. So what has happened here? Yeah, you see the part is not important. Let's talk about the frame. We have a very interesting frame in Austria regarding minority and integration. In Austria, there are two types of minority. There's a term which is usually translated by ethnic groups, which are so-called autochthonous ethnic groups with certain rights regarding language usage in public, regarding language training, regarding bilingual science in the street. And these are the so-called autochthonous ethnic groups situated in Carinthia in the Burgenland. And with regard to these groups, there's a framework of protection of cultural and linguistic diversity. With regard to immigration, with regard to union citizens, there's no debate. But with regard to third country nationals, there's a different framework, which is called integration. And this framework of integration doesn't speak about diversity, but it speaks very much about the duty of integration, meaning the duty to learn the German language and the duty to kind of assimilate to the Austrian way of life, whatever this is. But also this has some contradictions, because if people qualify for a top quality immigrant, top category of the red, white, red card, all integration duties are waived. So we do have a very strange framework. We have on the one hand a diversity frame for the so-called autochthonous traditional ethnic groups. We do have an integration frame for third country nationals, except of those who are very well qualified. And there's nothing about the largest group of immigrants, European Union immigrants, because they're of course covered by the right of free movement. What has happened? Why has this happened? I think you have to understand Austria. One has to know the framing, the institutional framing of Austria's immigration policy. Up to the 1990s, immigration policy in Austria was not developed within the parliamentary framework, but between a cooperative framework of cooperation between trade unions and the Chamber of Labour on the one hand, and the Association of Industrialists and the Chamber of Commerce on the other, which is called social partnership. Within this social partnership, at this time, was a strong linkage to the main dominant parties, center-right, center-left. The Chamber of Labour and the trade unions were linked to the Social Democrats, the Chamber of Commerce and the Association of Industrialists linked to the People's Party, the main center-right party. More or less, all regulations regarding access to Austria were regulated by granting access to the labour market, and this regulation was dealt within the social partnership. The parliament only approved it. In this framework, we have also a political framework at this time with two big parties covering between 85 and 90% of the electorate, and a small party, the Freedom Party, with 6%, 7%, 8%, something like that. This Freedom Party had its root into a very strong German nationalistic, partly Nazi past, and it was at this time very, very strongly opposing any rights for autochthonous minorities. So main mobilization was already on the ethnic court, but against this. And the Freedom Party changed dramatically with the rise of Jörg Haider, who changed it is German nationalism to a type of Austrian nationalism, moved away from anti-minority sentiment except in Carinthia, but put immigration in the center. So it was the first party, which was a small party, not involved into this social partnership elite, taking up the issue and politicizing it, mid of the 1980s. At the other hand, mid of the 1980s is also the time where the Green Party rose, and the Green Party also politicized immigration from a left-wing human rights perspective. And at this time, due to several changes, the parliament stepped in and immigration policies moved from social partnership to the Ministry of the Interior. So since the 1990s, parliamentary discussions were started, and before it was an issue nearly not debated in parliament, but these issues were politicized from far right and far left. So you have a quite early politicization, high politicization of these issues. And this politicization was led to something which has been explained before, to a debate on integration, which started in 1995, 1996, but really took place in the time of the coalition government between the People's Party and the Freedom Party between 1999 and 2008. What happened? In 2003, Austria for the first time instituted an integration contract, the duty of an integration contract, which was actually pushed for by the Freedom Party, by a splinter of the Freedom Party, the BZÖ, and argued that this duty of integration should select people who are ready to integrate from those who are not ready to integrate. In fact, a language test, a language tuition duty was installed. In the beginning, 100 hours, which was nearly nothing, with a lot of exceptions. But in the next phase, then the duty to learn German at the level of A2, and now there's a duty to learn German at the level of B1 to get a permanent residence permit. But despite the fact that in the political discourse there's a talk about the duty of integration, in practice there's a duty to learn the language and nothing else. There's nothing like in Denmark or in the Netherlands like a test of values. The test is simply a language test, which can be passed at any language institution. There are several specialized institutions. If you look at the training materials, you do see that there is some value debate in it, because in the training materials you do find some information about gender rights, etc. But these are not tested, it's simply a language test. What happened in this time, up until today, is that with this imposition of the language tests, mainly access to stable statuses were reduced. As well, access to permanent residence, as to naturalization, were made more complicated by raising the level of language knowledge, but also by raising the level of income, necessary income. Further, since 2010, Austria has developed a new immigration system, a points-based system based on the Canadian model, which also has a very interesting history. The first suggestion for a points-based model came from the Green Party, as in the Netherlands, more or less left-wing party, but not only left-wing, with a strong linkage to the Catholic Church and to the Caritas. They developed this system already in 2009. The second to jump on the bandwagon was the Austrian Association of Industrialists, which presented their model in 2010. And this model, more or less, was implemented by negotiations between the social partners in the end of 2010. And according to this model, integration conditions only apply for persons who are not in the top category. Persons who are in the top category, highly trained manager, highly trained professors, have no duty to integrate. Furthermore, integration became an element of immigration control by imposing pre-entry integration testing, like in the Netherlands. But this was only imposed partially, because due to the decision of the European Court of Justice, Dereci et al., it cannot be imposed anymore for Turkish immigrants. Only a very small part is covered. With regard to anti-discrimination, which is also a policy element here, this is just mentioned, we see a very weak implementation, which is not very new for countries. With rhetoric development, we could see in the last 5 to 10 years that there was a strong move from anti-immigrant rhetoric to anti-Islam rhetoric, particularly driven forward by the Freedom Party, who in the last election campaigns always campaigns, for example, against issues regarding rights of Muslims to wear headscarves or minarets, etc., etc. And there were some famous slogans like, for example, Daham statt Islam, at home instead of Islam, with which they were campaigning. Institutional framework has changed. This is the institutional framework in which Austria does develop its integration policies. And the strongest player is the Ministry of the Interior, which is, of course, responsible for all legal aspects. Other federal ministries, employment, education, have a say, as well as provincial governments, local governments, and the social governments. But what's happened recently are some interesting changes. In the Ministry of the Interior, for 2 years, the State Secretariat for Integration has been set up, which is actually something I was reminded of from listening to your presentation. This State Secretariat of Integration was set up by the center-right party, by the People's Party, within the Ministry of the Interior, and because there was a long time of pressure to set up a kind of integration state secretarial ministry, so they took up this issue to some extent. On the other hand, also local governments and provincial governments took up the issue. There are now 4 provinces where the provincial governments have issued kind of target programs for integration, which have to be developed involving different stakeholders, ranging from administration to NGOs, to service providers, etc., and kind of developing an understanding of integration. And this understanding of integration is very much focused on participation, equal rights, and improvement of living conditions, whereas the understanding of integration, also by the Ministry of the Interior, is more restrictive and more linked to security issues. Nevertheless, we still have the situation that Austria is a country where the established anti-immigrant party has up to 30% in local elections and provincial elections, and has been for a long time a member of the government, but still polls at around 20-25%. This has pushed the discourse on integration into a frame which is from the level of the Ministry of the Interior and the state government dominated by the idea that integration is a duty of immigrants, whereas the provinces have a stronger stressing that integration also is a duty of the government, of the administration, to allow more participation. But this discourse is kind of contradicted by the beginning discourse since 2010 about a positive picture of immigration, where there's the stress that immigrants are needed for Austrian society, are needed for the economy, but that Austria needs to select highly qualified immigrants, and thus to improve its culture of welcome for immigrants. And this discourse, again, is pushed forward by the Austrian Association of Industrialists, partly also by the Chamber of Commerce, and partly opposed by the trade unions, but supported by green parties and left. So we have a very strange bedfellowship here in this field, that the liberal elements in Austrian integration and migration policies are now a combination of industrialists, Greens, Catholics, and left-wings, and the more restrictive are right-wing parties, trade unions, and parts of the Social Democrats. And what also has happened that since the establishment of the State Secretariat for Integration, the discourse has moved more into the center of society. So the discourse is now less aggressive as it was. It's more technical to some extent, and gives more room to immigrants and immigrant organizations, and gives more room to views of immigrants in newspapers. So I would really support this idea that mainstream parties have to take up the issue and name and institutionalize the issue, because I think there has been some move. So summing up, this is also only a technical thing, summing up, Austria is a country which obviously leaves this path at the moment, this path of restrictiveness to some extent. Not so much with regard to the legal positions, The legal positions are rather strict, as you can see, but with regard to discourses, and moves to a different perspective, involving a very interesting coalitions between groups of society usually not linked together. We do not know how far this will go, but there are clear signs now in the debate that after the next elections, a Ministry of Family, Generations and Integration will be set up outside of the Ministry of the Interior, which might lead to a desecuritization of integration policies. But thank you, and would like to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Perchining, and now we'll move on to the fourth speaker, so that we have some time for discussion. So the fourth speaker is Mr. Shahamak Rezaei, and he is a faculty member he's an associate professor at Roskilde University in Denmark, and he has recently conducted a survey on radicalization processes among Muslim youth in Denmark. He also works at the International Journal of Business and Globalization at the Roskilde University. So I would like to give the floor to him, and I can also explore that we will see some video clip, which I think might make us once again. So please.
Thank you.
You can tell us what video will we see after this is ready.
No, it's okay.
I assume that weather is too hot for the computer.
Oh, you're too fast, that's why. Take it easy. Well, to start with, thank you for invitation. The way I come across working with you guys was during the joint publication that we had with my colleague, Dr. Mahfouri. And what I actually want to talk about is that that's the privilege of being the last one, so I've heard what all the others have said. What I can say now is that when we look at what Sarah said and what you said and what I'm probably going to say is that let's put it this way: in good old time, I've been in this business since '96, so I'm quite a grand old man in this business, at least in Denmark. And I've seen many tendencies. And what I heard from Sarah was that in good old days, late 90s, early 2000s, any Danish policymaker or researcher with respect for himself or herself would go to the Netherlands to learn something about integration policies. When we come around 2002, 3, something like that, and especially in mid-2000, somehow exaggeration is always good. So I exaggerate a bit. Any politician and researcher with respect for himself or herself in the Netherlands will come to Denmark to learn who is who in the Zoom and what's the name of the game regarding restrictions. So in that way, these two countries actually have been contributing a lot to the debate of integration. One on migration, the other one on restrictions, and then now we can discuss who comes first, chicken or the egg. But that's another story. But this is. From now on, I have about 15 minutes. So
we couldn't manage it, so now you have 3 minutes in.
I think what is lacking when we're talking about these things, I would say to many of my research colleagues as well, that we tend to forget that it takes two to dance tango. And there is that we are talking about what the society does against migrants and all these things, but we forget the other part. What about migrants? Very, very honest question. Is any migrant interested in integration at all? That's a very frank question. In my opinion, as being migrant as well, I've been living in Denmark 30 years. So I was young and handsome when I got to Denmark. I'll see what happened to me after 30 years. When I came to Denmark, to be honest with you, I didn't even know what integration was. And secondly, if anybody would think about that kind of things, they were not interested in that. Migrants are interested in one thing, and that is socio-economic mobility. That's why they moved from A to B. Let's say in Turkey, they moved from Turkey to from a village in Turkey to abroad, because the guy, he can see that his abilities, his labor is not appreciated, so he moves from A to B in order to achieve better socioeconomic mobility. When it comes to refugees, I would say that my definition of refugee is that he's a person, he or she is a person who moves or who flees out of the native country. When the escape is over, he tries in best possible way to become a human being again, whatever he was before, as a journalist, as worker, as political activist, as I don't know, doctor, as a teenager or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is the key term here is that we are dealing with people, we are dealing with individuals, and they are not necessarily having a luggage or baggage of cultural heritage that they really want to moving around. What they really want to is socioeconomic mobility, and what they really want to be appreciated as human beings. What we tend to forget is that we have a certain of social science theoretical approaches to human beings, and when it comes to migrants, we say, okay, all these models are applicable to human beings, but when it comes to immigrants, then we have to put some cultural or religious things on top of that. My understanding is that migrants, before they became migrants, they were actually human beings. If we take that argument on board, then we probably can look at these challenges from another perspective. And that's why, probably why, that I'm going to start my point of departure in an economic framework. In my understanding, individual immigrant or non-immigrants, they act rationally upon the available options and economic incentives. And further, I would say that they traditionally use ethnic and cultural explanations of the choices made by migrants in general, and immigrant enterprise owners in particular has rather limited explanatory strength to produce unconstructive perspectives. And that is exactly what happened with those political parties who took the agenda. They are focusing on the cultural differences, and they are focusing on cultural, religious, whatever. And I would say that if we understand the migration challenge from economic perspective, maybe we can understand why we have all these shortcomings. And shortcomings and pressure and extremism and radicalism, all these things comes from both sides. Whenever majority people they change, they put some restrictions, they put the pressure on a specific group, that group also reacts. That's going to be the last part of my slides. I did negotiate whether I should have this one or not. It takes some time. I know you know all these things, but due to the fact that I'm suffering from being economist, so I would like to tell you how I understand the economic way of looking at migration. What I understand is that we are dealing, my point of departure is that we are dealing with the welfare state regime, and the welfare state regimes are different in Europe, you all know that, but if you take departure in North European, it has some variation, but more or less it looks like that. If you take the most simple model, is that we have no immigrants, we have only natives, and if there is a distribution by normal fertility rate, then we will have this model, which is we are focusing on net contribution to public budgets. These people who are here between 16 and 65, the age can vary depending on which country we are into, but let's say this is a Danish case. They are contributing to the public budgets. They are surplus. These guys, kids, and the elderly population, they are a pressure on public budgets. So simple as that. These guys somehow are willing to pay for these guys because of the fact that they can see, if they are rational agents, they can see if they are going to get pensions, somebody must come and replace them. And the other guys are saying that we've paid, so you better pay to us. This is my logic. I think it's very simple, but it works. If you make it a little bit more realistic, we have natives distributed by low fertility rate and combined by aging population, which means there is a pressure there because we don't have those people who should work a labor market. They haven't been born, and our elderly the population are getting older and older. We do have a welfare state regime. That means that we have accepted that some natives can come on the labor market for a short time and go and get transfer income and be on long-term welfare. That means there is a pressure again on welfare budgets, on public budgets, because of the fact that they are getting unemployment aid and that kind of thing. And in good old days, late 60s, somebody said, okay, we can actually do, in order to maintain the production, we can do something interesting, and that is importing immigrants. They can come, they cost some money in the beginning. Normally they come when they are in their active, what do you call it, they are in the youth, and they can be, they can go directly to labor market. They come and contribute. We hope and we expect before they get so old, they leave. Empirical evidence shows that to start with, they didn't leave, most of them. Secondly, many of them actually, because of the fact that they got the lousest, the worst jobs, many of them actually died before they get that old. From economic point of view, or from a very cynical economist point of view, then the problem is solved. But this is what it is in theory. what happened was that many of these guys, although they were in their active, their active age, they also were on welfare, and that contributed to the first kind of hostile attitude against migrants when you refer to the Progress Party. And we are actually in somewhere around late 70s, early 80s, that in Denmark we had a focus on these people. The Progress Party came and said, these guys are not contributing, so they should go. On top of that, they called them, they didn't call them Muslims, they called them Muhammad believers. So it's even worse that, okay, these guys we don't want to touch at all. Not only that they are not contributing to the public budgets, they do not see our profit as their profit. They have a guy who called Muhammad and they cleave to him. So they better go back to their home. That was the very, very first thing that came to change the agenda. If we very fast look at how they were placed on labor market, and it goes for all European countries, they were never ever become member of core labor market. If they were very lucky and very well educated, they became member of peripheral labor market. Most migrants became member of the marginal labor market. That is to say, when you are here, if you have economic boom, then you can keep your job. When economic recession comes, you get out of it. You will be a pressure on public budgets. Some of these guys, as I said, just refer to my earlier speech my earlier point was that some of these guys, because of the fact that they were rational economic agents, they started to become self-employed. But they did the classical mistake. Instead of setting up business here, they set up their business over here in marginal business lines, which means that, again, very, very dependent on these guys, these business lines. When the economic situation goes down, when it's recession, then we come over here. Then we have taxpayers here who come and scream that these guys are not contributing any kind of contribution to our society. On top of that, their culture is not is not the same as ours, and the religion is not the same as ours either. So what do? Then we have the problem.
We have past 15 minutes, so we have 5 minutes to go since you negotiated in advance.
Okay, so we do it very fast. We do it. What I'm going to show you now is that we look at the incidence of overeducation. And overeducation is defined as an individual who possesses more education than it is strictly required for job. Bottom line is that because of the situation on the labor market, these guys should run faster and faster and got educated, but did they get the job that they should get? We have looked at it from that period, 1900 to 2003. We are also looking at the same thing from 2008 and 2011 is the same, but I have this already. When we look at the overeducation for Danes, we are dealing with 12%. When we're looking at the immigrants, we have 37%. Breaking down to the single national regions, you can see how it varies. Top is 44, bottom is 20, still much over the 12%. And we introduced this idea that we are dealing with norm divergence. Norm divergence indicate that there are patterns which are considered as norms, standards of a majority, and that there may be cases and processes of divergence and convergence. With norm divergence, we refer to a sociological phenomenon which refers to that whether individuals and collectives socioeconomic strategies in comparable social environment positively or negatively deviates from the norm or standard usually expressed through if you choose option A and follow the strategy B, and you should do that, you can, in the specific context, expect the result C. This is the logic. And if that does not apply, what happens? Then, in my opinion, since we are dealing with rational agents, then you will expect that those guys, they will make some kind of protest. We are not dealing with any kind of cultural clash, but we are, in my view, we are dealing with human instincts and probably animal instincts. So I would like you to look at it. It takes 3.5 minutes, and then I'm more or less done.
12:31.
Can you please enlarge?
Members of the auditorium. So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is how.
Can you please enlarge it?
And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more because after we did this like 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, with birds, and with chimpanzees. With Sarah Blossom, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put 2 capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group, they know each other, we take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the time.
You can play it right now.
No.
I'm afraid we've lost it. Maybe it was censored.
Two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group, they know each other, we take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them...
I'm afraid we don't give it to them.
If you give both of them cucumbers, they will be perfectly happy.
For the time, the 2 monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the part the grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have.
That's it?
No, it's going.
You have to see the monkeys.
The one on the left
You've seen it, I can
is the
see
one who
it.
gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes.
Yeah.
The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now. Gets again cucumber. She tests her rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets to it again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here. Let me tell you, I still have 2 minutes left. Let me tell you a funny story about this. This study became very famous, and we got a lot of comments, especially anthropologists, economists, philosophers. They didn't like this at all because they had decided in their mind, I believe, that fairness is a very complex issue and that animals cannot have it. And so one philosopher even wrote us that it was impossible that monkeys had a sense of fairness because fairness was invented during the French Revolution. Now, and another one wrote a whole chapter saying that he would believe it had something to do with fairness if the one who got grapes would refuse the grapes. Now the funny thing is that Sarah Boston, who's been doing this with chimpanzees, had a couple of combinations of chimpanzees where indeed the one who would get the grape would refuse the grape until the other guy also got the grape. So we're getting very close to the human sense of fairness, and I think philosophers need to rethink their philosophy for a while. So let me summarize. I believe there's an evolved morality. I think morality is much more than what I could be talking about, but it would be impossible without.
We need to repeat.
So what you see here is, what I just want to say to mention here is that immigrants, as I started to say, before they become immigrants, they were human beings. They can see all these patterns. They can see overeducation. They can see they become unemployed. They can understand what does policy change means. They can understand what will happen if we instead of letting me getting married with somebody, whether it's forced or not, that's another question. When I'm 18, so you can change it up to 24 that you would refer to. In Denmark, you have a regulation. If you are migrant, if you are getting married with somebody from abroad, and you or the person is below 24 years old, you cannot get married and make a family reunification. When you can see all these things, then it will also not only it will have influence on our politics and policies. Immigrants, they also go and make their own parallel society. It will lead to another kind of extremism, another kind of radicalization, and another kind of isolation, which is actually in competition with the changes in the mainstream society, and that is the most dangerous cocktail that I can see. And this has been forming. Some people still are denying that we do have parallel societies. I'm not agreeing, and I do believe that as much as tensions and restrictions that we see in mainstream societies, immigrants are also reacting upon it, and they make their own radical solutions to what the mainstream are imposing. That's what I want to say. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the video as well. And since we started a bit late, now we have about 15 to 18 minutes for discussion. So at first I would like to ask the audience whether there are some questions. So there's the first one, and then we will discuss here in the panel as well. So please, if you could state your name and direct your question.
Hello, my name is Tomáš Junget. I'm from the Faculty of Law of the Charles University. If I may come back to the presentation of Mr. Hokovský and the recommendations that you have put forward, I did realize that Ms. Dolan already hinted in her presentation that she was not fully in compliance with those recommendations, but maybe we might explore this issue further, since apparently in the Netherlands basically all of the recommendations have been met in one way or another, or as I see it from this perspective. because the issue of immigration and minorities has been politicized. It has been put higher on the agenda, and it has been a matter of conflict within mainstream parties. In any regard, it ended up with a result which we might probably not be very satisfied with. And that's the issue that I see in the recommendations, that they are not actually content related. They don't really, you haven't talked about what kind of immigration policy we actually do want to achieve, but only have given a set of very broad recommendations which are not very, it is not clear from them what are we actually aiming for, and also it is a question to me whether we can do this without a proper specific country-specific context, and whether this is actually possible, because then again we have an Austrian or other experience which is of course very different indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's absolutely true that the issue was politicized and put high on the agenda, but the question is by whom? And the problem is that it was politicized by the extreme parties, and they put it as actually the main priority. Our recommendation is that the mainstream parties should take it. And the problem why actually we see the gains of the extremists is that the mainstream parties are not able to answer, that they are not able to compete with the extremists. And we believe from our research that it is because they are not able to explain their proposals, they are not able to explain their policy recommendations, their policies. They are not able to explain the policies which are in place, and therefore the extremists are winning because they are proposing something new, and they are basically questioning the measures, the policies that exist right now. Concerning the substance, in our research, that was not up to us to propose what should be the substantial, the actual policies. With that we deal in the second part of our research, which is about the actual measures. However, this is still, I think, on the mainstream political parties. The Christian Democrats, the center-right mainstream, they should propose their coherent policies according to their core values and their authentic program. And the Social Democrats, the other part of the mainstream, the center-left, should also propose their policies. And the competition should not be between the mainstream and the extremists, but it should be constructive, decent competition between the mainstream parties, basically, and country-specific. Indeed, these measures should be country or even local specific.
Thank you, Radko. Is there a follow-up on the panel?
Yeah, maybe since I raised the issue to start with, I should say something about it as well. I think that most of the recommendations that are in the report do work as long as a populist radical right party is not yet represented in parliament and has not gained a very prominent platform. Because parliamentary representation also means media exposure and all kinds of other means to influence the political and the public debate. Now the problem is, of course, that there's many both East European and West European countries where the parties are already in place and have a very strong position, and that changes the game significantly, mainly because of one thing, and it is issue ownership. We know that citizens vote not only on the basis of programs, but also on their perceived competence and credibility of parties. And just as social democratic parties are seen most competent when it comes, for example, to labor market policy or education policies, and liberal parties are seen as most competent when it comes to taxation and finance, populist radical right parties are seen as most competent when it comes to immigration issues. And on the other side of the political spectrum, green parties or more social liberal parties like we have in the Netherlands or exist in Denmark. So it's very difficult for mainstream parties to change their positions and be perceived as credible, because it looks like they're merely copying what populist radical right parties are proposing. And it's been very difficult, I think, for mainstream parties, especially in Western Europe, to develop a vision on the multicultural society that is in line with their deep core values, that is a social democratic vision on the multicultural society, or that is a Christian democratic vision on the multicultural society. So I think that point when you mentioned, it needs to be about ideological conflict between the parties that fits their different perspectives, and that is something that we haven't seen yet.
Thank you, Sarah. Just a technical comment. We are ending up this discussion at 17:45, so we have like 18 minutes to go. Mr. Perchining, please.
I would like to add some points from the Austrian experience. I do agree that the discussion should be brought into the realm of the mainstream parties. This was one of the main problems in Austria, that it was politicized due to the specific situation that the social partnership kind of discussed everything outside of parliament by fringe parties which on both sides. But I think there's a second point which I learned in the last 2 years. You need also an institutionalization of the issue at the level of government. We were all people in this field, being from left to more conservative wing, were rather skeptical when this new State Secretariat of Integration was set up, because the argument was that there's no power behind it, nothing can be changed. And there hasn't been a lot of change with regard to policies. The policies are restrictive as they are, but there has been a lot of change regarding the discourse, because there is now an institution which communicates that this is a part of normal policy making, like medical issues are part of medicine, is a part of health policy, is a part of policy making, social policy, etc., etc. Is the first thing. The second thing, I think, which is necessary, is a kind of reframing, and in the Austrian case, it was done. I think it was an interesting case, but because what happened is that integration was linked with merit. So the slogan now is integration through merit. So you have to earn your integration, your status, which is a very conservative concept. But on the other hand, the Social Democrats and the left wings also quote this concept, because it was merit instead of country of birth or country of origin or whatever. So people should be judged by the merit and not by the place of birth or by the origin. So both parties, this was very broadly accepted in the Republic, because a frame was found which covered kind of basic understanding of justice, what you said. People should contribute and should be judged according to their contribution and not according to their place of birth. I think these are two aspects which are also interesting to see and important to it.
Thank you, Mr. Perchining. Is there another follow-up on the panel? No. So, question? All right, so there are two, so we'll start with the lady and then go for the gentleman.
Thank you. Nanotiska, Office of the Government. I would like to address my question to Mr. Rezaei. Thank you for your explanation of the causes that may trouble Europe or our society. And I would like to know what's your perception about the solution. What measures should be taken to prevent these troubles or to stop them? Thank you.
So please, do not be that long, if I may ask, please.
Let me put it very, very short. Instead of talking about them, talk with them. That's one way. And the other thing is that looking at people as rational economic agents, I can hear how biased I am, but I would say that many of, let me put it in an example. The case of integration is that if you take it from a labor market point of perspective, a person can be integrated and contribute to the society and be a full member of the society. When he goes, let's say, when he has his own shop from 9 to 4 and don't be a burden on a society, and after, when he closes his shop, he can be so destructive. On the other hand, a person can be on a public welfare, in our understanding, not be integrated and not speak and do not speak the language, but if an old lady falls on her bicycle, he comes as a part of the society and helps the woman, the lady, to the society. Let me make my first example a bit clearer. If you take Copenhagen and look at the Pakistani community, they are seen as to be the most religious and Muslim, and many of the radical Muslims that you have found in Denmark, they belong to the Pakistani group. They are member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, they are member of a lot of nasty organizations. But on the other hand, when you look at what they are doing in the society, one could say that almost all Pakistanis, with respect for themselves, they are also of a kiosk shop in Copenhagen. The only two items that you can make a lot of money on in a kiosk is alcoholic beverages, and porn magazines. This is strictly against Islam. But the guy does that from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. because he needs money. And after, when he goes home, he can do two things. One is it's regretting and wants to have forgiveness from his God, and the other way is that God, thank you, you gave me the opportunity to have this kiosk so I can make Danes to become more alcoholic or more dependent on porn magazine. But this guy is not making any kind of integration problem. When you look at the definition of what integration is, the other guy who is making a lot of problems, who has been in Denmark in 30 years, not one day has been working and has been receiving transfer income, he will be, if he steals a chewing gum, he will probably be kicked out of the country. So what's the meaning of integration? Then I'll come back to your question.
Just briefly, if you may, so others can react as well.
We should look at the core of the problems rather than making them bigger and bigger. We should redefine how we understand our fellow citizens rather than making some rules to fight against, because we might fight with the wrong guys. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there anybody on the panel? No. So another question, please. We have like 10 minutes to go.
I'm Pavel Žižinský. I'm from the Multicultural Center of Prague. I have one question and one remark. First question for you, Mr. Radko Hokovský, regarding your methodology in the research. As I understood you came to the conclusion that the more right-wing you are, the more you justify your statements about immigration. It's interesting. You said you had basically three types of justification: pragmatic, identity-based, and moral, universal. I think I see a bit problem if you can really put these three types of justifications on the same level. Yeah. If you really can say that, if I say, well, I don't like you are black because I'm white and we are here white in Europe, it's an identity-based, very low justification, but I do not think that it's on the same level in the eyes of democracy and so on, as if you argue by pragmatic, well, the migrants do not take so much social aid, for example. Some research in Britain that usually average British citizen takes double so high more public public aid as migrant. So this is my question to your methodology.
So Radko would answer that, and then we come back for a remark if we have time. Radko, please.
Or maybe
Sorry, is the remark connected to the
A little bit.
So go forward, please.
We, among the NGOs, we discuss very long the question of politicization. Should politics more discuss about migration or not? Sometimes we think it's maybe good that in Czech Republic the politicians do not discuss so much about migration because what would be the outcomes of the discussion? And I suggest that, well, there is some sphere there should be more politics. This is basically the labor migration from third countries. That is the space for politics. It should be discussed in the parliament and not just solved by some bureaucrats in the Ministry of Interior, maybe, because they are issuing the first immigration visa. But then there are spheres where there should not be, maybe, in my opinion, so much room for politics, but there should play a bigger role the topic of human rights, asylum, family reunion, and so on. These are more matters of human rights, of some legal entitlement on some equality and so on. So this would be my opinion. I think the difference can be that there are values which should not just politicize, or that you should not discuss, put into free discussion. So if I would like to politicize maybe the Jewish question, I would be anti-Semitic. But if I want to discuss Muslim question, why is it not the same?
Thank you, Radko.
Thank you for the questions. Concerning the justifications, well, we are not saying that they are on the same level, that they are valid the same, but simply the parties are using these three kinds of justifications. And the main point is that the mainstream parties generally don't dare, they simply don't try to justify their statements. I think this is the main outcome, that they simply state, very often they advocate, for example, the current or the past, well, let's say the current immigration policy, or that kind of integration policy, which is produced by the ministries or whoever is in charge, and they don't explain, they don't justify why it should be, and that we see as a problem because it leaves room for the extremists who apparently are much more willing to explain why they are proposing this or that. We are not judging whether the identity-based is on the same level kind of justification as a universal moral justification or the pragmatic one. However, even the mainstream parties, for example, the Social Democrats, they could adopt identity-based justification, saying we are Europeans or we are humans. Well, that would be more universal, but we are Europeans, and in Europe we have these values. This is our identity, and according to this identity, we propose this and that integration or immigration policy. So they can use it, but they don't. They simply don't develop justification rhetoric which would attract voters. They simply leave this to the extremists. And this comes to your second question concerning the politicization. I'm perfectly aware that this is a controversial proposal, but let's have a look on what is the alternative. To leave it, to keep it as a technical, legal issue, issue which is supposed to be dealt by civil servants somewhere in the ministries, issue about which we don't talk about the parliament, but this is the situation when the extremists are able to take gains in this discussion, because they are the only ones then who are talking about that. I mean, of course, today we have the situation in Western European countries when everybody is talking about it. But the mainstream parties in Western Europe are only reacting to the extremists, who actually put the agenda, who put it high on the agenda. and they are forcing the mainstream parties to only react. Our proposal is that the mainstream parties should understand that they have to be active in the issue. They have to develop their own genuine integration and immigration program based on their values, and decently and constructively speak about it. And if the argument is that the extremists are considered competent in the issue, that this is exactly the problem. The mainstream should make efforts to become perceived as competent on this issue.
Thank you, Radko. Mr. Perchining?
If you allow me to add to this comment, we had this discussion in the 1990s in Vienna, and maybe we have to tell you the background between 1992 and 2000. I was not working in the academic world, but for the Viennese Funds for Integration, which was set up in 1992 by the city of Vienna, one of the first institutions in this field in Europe. And at this time, the city was governed by a very broad social democratic majority, and we were discussing with the city and the city and the mayor and the council, do your job, but don't talk about it. So we were really a little bit, we were criticizing government sometimes, but we don't want to make a big voice on it as a city and as a democratic body. What happened in this time is that the freedom party gained and gained and gained. And I don't want to say that now it does not gain anymore, but it has stopped gaining or it's even reducing, maybe not because of city politics, but now for some 8 to 10 years, the city government of Vienna has decided to define itself as a city of diversity and have a clear line, and also discuss very on the base and within the people on conflicts. Where there was a program on living together with about 400 to 500 discussions in houses, in quarters, whatever, on what are the problems with mediators. And what turned out was that many so-called cultural problems were problems of living together, lots of children, people visits in the night, etc., etc. And so this helped to kind of bring the discourse into a more civilized frame. And I think since then, the city has a good stance. It has a clear position, also stating what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, but generally arguing that diversity is strengthening the city and that it's welcoming immigrants. And since then, I think it was more successful also for the Social Democratic Party. But this is just an experience from Vienna, and my view from Vienna might be completely different here in the Czech Republic. But I would also say it's worth to clearly state where one stands.
Thank you. We have time for a last comment or very brief question. If there is none, so, Sarah or Mr. Rezaei. So maybe first, and then Mr. Rezaei, and then we'll go for a section.
There's two things that I would like to respond to that have been said earlier. I think the example of Vienna is very well, and I think it demonstrates that a very diversified approach is important. Because the city of Amsterdam has taken a lot of similar measures. Some very discursive and symbolic. It has abandoned the tone of the term allochtone, which is very prominent in Dutch debate to describe non-European citizens. And that works in Amsterdam because Amsterdam is a very cosmopolitan city with higher educated citizens to a large extent. A lot of the people who have issues with immigration have moved to other cities because of the phenomenon of white flight. So at the local and regional level, I think you need very diversified approaches that fit the kind of population and composition that certain cities have and the kind of problems they experience. The second thing is that I agree that the institutionalization of immigration and integration issues, for example, through a ministry or a junior ministry, is important. But there's also a risk there. In the Netherlands, we've had a junior minister for immigration and integration since the 1990s, and it's been upgraded later to a proper ministry. But the minister that was put there under the second and the third Balkan in the government was actually the most populist politician the Liberal Party has ever experienced. So she actually didn't contribute to a informed and qualified debate in any way. She probably only made matters worse, and at a later stage she was actually expelled from the Liberal Party and founded her own populist party. So it is not only a matter of institutionalization, it also matters greatly who the people are who are then put in charge.
Mr. Rezaei, and your very last comment.
Just want to say a couple of things about what has happened in Denmark. In Denmark, we experienced that the Social Democratic Party, when they were in power from 1993 to 2001, they tried to some kind of neglect the right wing, the extreme right wing, and try to, let's say, not talking to them and hoping that they will die out. On the contrary, what happened was that they became stronger and stronger, and nowadays, after 10 years having liberal government, the last couple of years we've had Social Democratic back again. What you can see is that now the Social Democrats are probably, I wouldn't say they are tougher than the extreme right wing, but they are as tough as them. They are taking the same thing, and they are dealing with this matter. I think the lesson is that if you sit and hope that you can make the right wing to disappear by not commenting them, by not dealing with them, by shutting them off from everything, and hope that everything will disappear, it will have a backslash, which is probably 10 times worse. Yeah.
Thank you for your last comments, and I'm so sorry for being late on the schedule. Now, right now, we can move on to the reception, where my colleagues will take you, and you might continue the discussion in an informal setting with our colleagues who will be joining you. So thank you very much for your participation, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.